United States is getting ready for a momentous day on Wednesday as the House of Representatives is expected to vote to impeach President Donald Trump. Protesters' numbers were down nationwide on Tuesday, but it was the biggest march in Paris since the strike against the pension reform began. France is gearing up for the 14th consecutive day of transport disruption as the government and trade unions meet to try to break the gridlock. And the British Parliament begins swearing in its new MPs as Boris Johnson promises to use his comfortable Conservative majority to take Britain out of the EU by the end of next month. Thank you for joining us here on France 24. Washington is gearing up for a momentous day in U.S. history on Wednesday. The House of Representatives, which is dominated by the Democratic Party, is expected to vote to impeach Donald Trump. The vote will cover 2 articles of impeachment: abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. In a fiery letter sent to Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, Trump maintained he did nothing wrong and claimed, quote, that more due process was afforded to those accused in the Salem witch trials.
The whole impeachment thing is a hoax. We look forward to getting on to the Senate. We're not entitled to lawyers. We're not entitled to witnesses. We're not entitled to anything in the House. It's a total sham. They took a perfect phone call that I had with the president of Ukraine, an absolutely perfect call. You know it. They all know it. Nothing was said wrong in that call. To impeach the president of the United States for that is a disgrace, and it's a mark in our country.
Well, ahead of Wednesday's crucial vote, lawmakers spent much of Tuesday trying to lobby representatives and senators alike. France 24's Katifan Gorgistani has more from Washington.
With impeachment just around the corner, the top figures in the country spent the day in public tit-for-tats with the Senate leaders Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer trading barbs over the structure of the future Senate trial, while Donald Trump was sending a blistering letter to Nancy Pelosi, which read like his final closing arguments. In it, he blasted the House Speaker for what he called an unprecedented abuse of power, accusing her of staging an open war on American democracy. Nancy Pelosi dismissed the letter, calling it sick and ridiculous, but she did have a letter of her own for her fellow Democrats, urging them to join her on the House floor to vote for those 2 articles of impeachment and to vote to defend the U.S. Constitution. The vote will likely fall mostly along party lines, with so far only 2 Democrats saying that they would be voting against impeachment, including Jeff Van Drew, who is expected to switch his party affiliation from Democrat to a Republican. The Republicans are expected to be once again extremely united. They will be trying to slow down the whole voting process with procedural tactics, and they will try to express one final time their extreme disdain for this whole impeachment process. But bar a huge surprise, Donald Trump will become only the 3rd U.S. president to be formally impeached in what is bound to be a historic vote.
It was another day of protests across France today. According to the government, 615,000 people took to the streets nationwide. That number is down compared to recent weeks. But the capital saw the biggest protest since the strike began 2 weeks ago, as the standoff between unions and the government over the planned pension reform continues. Prime Minister Edouard Philippe is set to meet with union leaders on Wednesday in the hopes of finding a solution to the crisis. But protesters in Paris today say they're ready for the long haul.
Our main social demand is social justice. For many years, especially since this government took power, we've been seeing our social rights melt under the sun. And this is the straw that broke the camel's back.
If we take a break, then we're stopping the strike. If we don't strike, then he will push his reform through in January. So we have to stop him. We have to be logical. People didn't strike for about 15 days just to stop and say, no, let's go see Santa Claus.
Well, our very own Valérie Decamp was at Tuesday's protests in the French capital. She has this roundup of what was the biggest Paris march since the movement began.
All major unions showed a united front in France and here in Paris today, with one of the more moderate unions, the CFDT, joining the protests against controversial pension reforms. The CFDT had not been part of the strike so far, but joined the protests after it said the government had crossed a red line when it announced that it was also introducing the so-called pivot age, according to which people retiring at the legal age of 62 would only get a reduced pension, unlike people retiring at the age of 64 who would get a full pension. So all the labor unions marching together here in Paris and all across the country, but divisions remain among the unions. The majority of the unions are calling for the government to scrap the reforms altogether, while the CFDT is urging the government to drop the pivot age. Clashes erupted here in Paris at the Place de la Nation by the end of the day, but the protests remain largely peaceful throughout the day. We are also entering a crucial week for the government and the labor unions, just a few days away from the beginning of the Christmas holiday. And there's one main question that remains: will there be a truce for over the Christmas break? In any case, Prime Minister Edouard Philippe has said that there is room for negotiations. He is meeting with all the leaders of the unions on Wednesday.
And the French government has nominated Laurent Pietraszewski, a member of parliament, to become the new Secretary of State in charge of pensions. He will replace Jean-Paul Delevoye, who resigned on Monday after admitting he had failed to disclose 13 private sector posts in a recent asset declaration. Delevoye was the main architect behind the controversial reform. The new British Parliament began meeting this Tuesday, 5 days after the Conservative Party's resounding win in the general election. MPs began being sworn in ahead of the Queen's speech on Thursday, but all eyes were on Prime Minister Boris Johnson as he promised to use his party's majority to take Britain out of the EU by January 31st. James Wilson has the details.
Britain's Parliament is back with a new Conservative pro-Brexit majority of 80. The ancient rituals and pageantry may be the same, but Prime Minister Boris Johnson has made clear that big changes are on the horizon, starting with Britain's departure from the European Union in January.
But I mean absolutely no disrespect to those who are no longer with us, Mr. Speaker. But I think that this Parliament is a vast improvement on its predecessor. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if you can guess what this Parliament is going to do once we put the withdrawal agreement back. We're going to get Brexit done.
The lack of a majority made governing difficult and chaotic for his predecessor, Theresa May. Johnson can expect less trouble from his fellow Conservative lawmakers, but the Prime Minister still has a bulging inbox of problems. After winning 45% of the Scottish vote in the election, the Scottish National Party are asking for a new referendum on whether the country should become independent from the rest of Britain. And although the UK will leave the EU next month, it's not due to leave the bloc's single market and customs union until the end of 2020, meaning the final second phase of the Brexit negotiations must be completed within the next 12 months, something the EU says will be difficult.
We are voicing a concern that the period for negotiating a trade agreement is going to be very limited.
But for now, Johnson is enjoying a honeymoon period. He's won the biggest Conservative majority since Margaret Thatcher, and like her, he hopes to use his premiership to transform Britain.
Students took to the streets of Algiers by the thousands on Tuesday, the first round of student protests since the widely contested election of President Abdelmajid Tebboune. Demonstrators reject the new head of state and say he's part of the system that they've been trying to change. Cole Stangler has the details.
Back in the streets and headed to downtown Algiers. Student protesters remained as defiant as ever.
We're in the street to change the system. They haven't put into place our demands. If that were the case, the movement would have stopped. They've changed the people, but not the ideas. We want them to change the ideas, not just the people.
Some demonstrators wore eye patches in solidarity with victims of police violence, which they say took place last week during and after Thursday's presidential election. Amid calls to boycott the vote, Abdelmajid Tebboune was elected with turnout of just 40%. On Monday, the newly elected president extended an offer of dialogue to the 9-month-long protest movement known as Al-Hirak.
We are against a dialogue without the release of prisoners. We are against this government's attempt to manipulate, to divide the popular movement.
A sense of outrage that hasn't died down after the vote, and in contrast to the reaction in Paris. On Tuesday, President Emmanuel Macron said he had taken note of Algeria's election and wished the new president his sincere wishes for success.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government has said it will not back down despite furious protests against the new citizenship bill. Home Minister Amit Shah said the country's leaders were, quote, firm like a rock as violent demonstrations continued in several Indian cities. The new bill would fast-track citizenship for applicants from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, but only for non-Muslims.
Protesters are mounting a serious challenge to India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Hindu nationalist government. The Indian Parliament has decided to grant citizenship to illegal immigrants who fled religious persecution from Afghanistan, Bangladesh and Pakistan. People of all religions can apply, except one, Muslims. Yet there are 200 million Muslims in India, and many believe the law is a deliberate snub to their community.
When India got freedom in 1947, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, all were together to bring about freedom. Without Muslims, we would not have been able to get freedom.
However, the Indian government says the law is to protect people who have fled religious persecution in Muslim-majority countries, so there is no need to extend its provisions to Muslims.
I want to say that whatever political protest you want to do, the Modi government of the Indian People's Party is firm that all refugees will get citizenship. They will become citizens of India, and they will live with respect in the world.
So fierce has been public opposition in some areas that hundreds of protesters have been injured and several killed in clashes with police. And in the northeastern state of Assam, access to the internet will be restricted until Friday at the earliest.
A Pakistani court has sentenced the country's former president, General Pervez Musharraf, to death. The treason case was held in absentia as Musharraf is currently living in Dubai and has refused to return for the trial. Ellen Gainsford has more.
He refused to appear in court, but in his absence he's been handed the ultimate sentence. On trial for treason, General Pervez Musharraf was given the death penalty by a 3-member special court in Islamabad. His lawyer denies the charges.
I say this complaint is false. This complaint is wrong. It was just to victimize him. I'm not admitting the complaint.
The sentence relates to his time as military ruler of Pakistan, when in 2007 he suspended the constitution, imposing emergency rule in a bid to extend his time in power. It's the first time in Pakistan's history that a former army chief and leader has received such a verdict.
Brothers and sisters, your armed forces have never and shall never let you down.
It's a significant moment in a country where the military holds much sway. Musharraf came to power in 1999 after ousting former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif in a coup. When Sharif later retook power, he accused Musharraf of treason in 2013, and the general was formally charged in 2014. Musharraf has been out of the country since 2016, when he was allowed to leave on bail to seek medical treatment abroad. Musharraf is currently living in Dubai and is unlikely to travel home to face his latest sentence, as the UAE and Pakistan have no formal extradition treaty.
That is your news for now. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to France 24.